Should go well. Now, if I can introduce today's speaker, Professor Don Beith. There's some information about him in the flyer, so I won't repeat that. But I will tell you that one of the really wonderful things that has happened at the Mitchell Center in the last couple of years is when Don Beith got in touch during the summer of 2019 to express his interest in working with us to help advance the Mitchell Center's efforts to create a brighter future right here in Maine. Now, of course, there's a lot of questions you need to ask to figure out what we even mean by a brighter future. And you definitely want a philosopher like Don to help you figure out what the right questions are to ask. And you'll hear more about that today. If you read Don's work, you'll quickly realize that he's a brilliant scholar, but he also has a warm and pragmatic approach to philosophy that he generally shares with others, as he's going to do today. Just two different kinds of things Don's doing right now. He's created a really innovative program in environmental ethics at the University of Maine, but he also hosts philosophical walks in the university forest. I think he's going to mention that in his talk. Way back in 2008, we invited Mary Evelyn Tucker, one of the leading scholars in the world about world religions. She gave the Mitchell Lecture on Sustainability, and she gave a wonderful talk about the moral, ethical, and spiritual challenges associated with environmental stewardship. And if I didn't realize it before that time, I definitely knew it then, that we needed someone like Don to help us use the field of philosophy to strengthen our stewardship efforts. He's going to help us think about that today in his talk, Cultivating Ecological Virtues. Take it away, Don.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Linda. Thanks to everyone at the Mitchell Center. I'm really excited about today's talk because I get to practice what I'm talking about. I'm here to learn how to talk about climate change and how we can become different and better people to address some of the ecological issues we face. So I want to talk to you about virtue ethics. I'll give you a little crash course in virtue ethics and explain how this is already a way of thinking about ethics and values and who we are and our habits that is ecologically oriented. But specifically, I want to apply it to ecological issues and problems and opportunities, and in the spirit of a workshop to get you to think about how we could form more ecologically positive habits and how we can think about ethics itself as a way of being ecological. More about that. The format of our workshop will be me talking for a little bit, and I'll interrupt the talk at 2 points to ask you a brief audience poll. After which I hope we'll have time for some short breakout rooms. And in those rooms, I hope random groups of you can improvise. Each group will have a moderator. Thankful to Linda, Danaha, Andy, and Thomas for helping out today. And the goal there is to share some ideas or insights you have, maybe some experience from your own practical field about how we can cultivate more ecological habits and think ethically about climate change and human development and sustainability. Afterward, we'll recap for a brief little session where each group can debrief and report some of your findings and share general questions with the audience. So I'll be happy to talk to you in a little bit. At the University of Maine, I teach environmental ethics, medical ethics, and existentialism. Today, I really want to think about that first part and both the question of how our habits and ethics can have better ecological impact, but again, also how we can make those practices themselves more attuned to nature, more ecological. I researched in some of the themes that David talked about. You can email me or check out my book or some of my writing about them. I'm very much interested in writing more accessible, community-oriented philosophy, so I really look forward to hear from people from different backgrounds. As David said, there are weekly campus forest walks on Fridays at noon. I encourage you to come if you want to talk about any of these themes and just enjoy the woods. I always include for fun that I'm Canadian, and I have this sign from the state of Maine, "The way life should be," as a reminder to think about ethics. The difference about ethics as a field, as a disciplinary way of studying the world, is that unlike the sciences which look at the world as it is, the way life should be, that's the orientation that ethics is about. So, ethics is really about not just thinking about facts that we can observe about nature, the laws we observe, but thinking about, on the basis of those facts, what should we do? What values should we have? What laws and policies? And in this talk, we want to think about what kind of people we should become. And that's really I think, the beauty of virtue ethics. It's about not just making sustainable decisions, but thinking about becoming new and different and better people. And I think a lot of us agree that it will require us learning to be new people to face a lot of the problems we're dealing with in 2020. And we'll talk about that today a little bit too. So here's some visuals, some advertisements for the environmental ethics minor and the contemplative nature walks that David told you about. Please get in touch if you want any more info about that stuff. So I want to think about this guiding question of whether character traits have ecological consequences, what kind of ecological consequences, and why. I want you to think about character traits and values that support sustainability. In particular, I want us to think today about developing our own set of eco-virtues. What are positive enabling habits that promote sustainability? What are traits that in our character contribute to ecological degradation or problems? How can we think of vices or bad habits we have with ecological orientation? And I think virtue ethics is a really rich way of doing this because it starts thinking about how we relate to all the environments around us, how we develop dispositions and desires to cope with those environments. So virtue ethics is a study of habit that looks at habit beyond the lens of behaviorism. Habit is more than just a neutral skill or a technique or something detached from your personality. Virtue ethics involves looking at habits as the fabric of who you are. Your habits are things you struggle with. They're the avenues through which you negotiate the world. And so it's this very personal, subjective way of studying habits. And we're interested in good habits, habits that can be called virtues, because it seems like there's no limit for how much we can improve those. There's no limit to how good at listening you can be, or playing guitar, or developing sustainability. The virtue ethics approach is very rich because it can look at we can look to different traditions and find examples there. A lot of the examples I'll talk about are a mix of ancient Greek and contemporary ecological philosophy, but we can look to Buddhist tradition, for example, the four Brahma Viharas. We can think about virtue in that tradition. You can think about virtue in your own community, in your own profession, in your own culture. And I think sharing those ideas, sharing those values is really powerful ethical learning experience. I think habits are very ethically powerful because they're deeply ingrained not just in who we are, but in what we care about. Habits can help motivate us to form new and positive desires that desire sustainable and supportive human environments, environments that create the conditions of flourishing. The issue, though, is that a lot of philosophers, the tradition of virtue ethics, and I think people in general usually think about virtues in a human-centered domain, right? The virtues of the workplace or the family, or virtues of peace and warfare and things like this. What would it mean to expand the horizon of thinking about virtues to the environment and to sustainability concerns? I think the virtue ethics approach is ecologically significant in a number of ways. First of all, it roots our idea of ethical goodness in nature. And virtue ethics is an approach that looks at what is good by looking at what's good for each individual being, life form, and ecosystem. It's the approach that says what matters is that each thing, each entity, each life form, each system is given an opportunity to flourish. Right? So instead of imposing my good on something else, it's this naturalistic way of saying, okay, there's a life form, there's an ecosystem, there's a person, there's a society. How can we create the conditions and behaviors and habits that help that society to flourish? So it's rooted in, its concept of the good is rooted in nature or flourishing or health. Second of all, by thinking about virtues as sensitive ways of responding to situations, we notice that this is a very ecological way of thinking about ethics. By thinking about behaviors and dispositions instead of, say, consequences or rules or laws, we put ourselves in an ethical situation to be better attuned to the changing environments around us. So virtue ethics is, in a way, already an ecologically sensitive approach to ethics. And I think there's a lot of potential to make that more impactful. Thirdly, virtue ethics in environmentalism can promote good environmental ecological outcomes. We can talk about those. And lastly, it can change our character. And I want to think about that. What kind of character do we need to have given the problems we face? How can we get there? Part of the discussion is about distributing resources and sustaining natural systems. But part of this also is about a question of what we're sustaining, why we're sustaining it, and who we are, what kind of people we are, and what those activities of sustainability mean to us, and the joy and learning we take from them. So virtue ethics, I think, promotes this idea alongside ecological sustainability of an ecology of mind or a psychological sustainability. And that's the thing I want to think about in today's workshop. Virtue sometimes has the ring of this really obsolete idea of nobility or propriety. But I want to think of it today as a way of cultivating the conditions of flourishing for human beings and others. I want to expand that circle again. I want to think about virtue as a process in today's world of becoming people who are ecologically oriented and perceiving the conditions of what are required for a good life as much bigger than their own individual life, right? That's challenging enough. But I think part of the model of ecological virtue will really involve this idea of a long-term intergenerational scale where we can cultivate these values of vision, foresight, attunement, perseverance, trust. And I want to hear from you what you think some of those other virtues would be. To do this, I want to think a little more deeply about habits. Again, we've seen that habits are not just these neutral skills we have. They're not just automated parts of ourselves. They're related to our character and our personality. If you're a nervous person, for example, if you have a habit of being nervous, it's not so easy to separate that from your personality. The same as if you're a cautious person, and so on. And so we think of habit as more than something you just think about, as something that structures the world all around us in ways we often don't notice. So we can think about habits in a way as the unwritten laws or the behavioral norms that we don't always think about, and nevertheless are engrossed in and reflect a lot of values for us. And this is part of the problem about habits, even good ones. They're things that are slippery philosophically. They're difficult to have, and I think we know this. It's difficult to be self-aware of your own habits because you're immersed in them. You know, we talk about riding a bike or driving a car. I think the car is a really good example there. We're all part of this massive car culture. It's a second nature to us, so much so that we don't always think about it. And a lot of the habits we have related to that culture are, of course, ecologically dangerous and risky. So I want to think about ecological bad habits that go unnoticed, perhaps wastefulness, indifference. I want you to think of some other ones. I want to think about this problem deeply, about how habits empower us, but also make us insensitive to environments. So any habit I learn involves forgetting, right? I forget the steps that went into learning to speak English and learning to write. And so I'm not fully aware of them. And that's what makes it so easy to move my cognitive attention to other activities like thinking about philosophy or talking to you. But that involves, again, a kind of learned insensitivity. So I want us to be sensitive to the fact that the very way we learn is itself a process of transforming and changing our environmental sensitivities to free up and enable our attention for some things, sometimes at the cost of um, closing off our sensitivity to others. And I think a lot of our habits that we've learned in Western North American culture, for example, really are habits that detach us from our bodies, detach us from physical activity, detach us from our natural environments, and detach us from other species and so on. So we can think about that. Habits, importantly, are dispositions formed over a long time. It's a way of thinking about ethics that's lifelong, that involves reflection on the repeated daily activities we're performing. So again, driving is a good example there. And thinking not just about what we should do, but how we should do it and the meaning and depth of that activity, right? Aristotle says we become good and bad guitar players the same way by playing the guitar. The real question is how we do that and how we think about it and the guidance we have. So I want to hold on to this idea of thinking about virtue and good habits as necessary to secure the conditions of a sustainable and healthy life. And I want to remember that everything and everyone flourishes in different ways and under different conditions. So when I think about how a blade of grass or a tree flourishes, that's different than thinking about a pet animal or a dairy cow. That's different than thinking about a child. It's different than thinking about a philosophy professor, a farmer, a soldier, an activist, or anyone else. So virtue is this rich idea because it's so flexible. It's this ecological idea because it looks to different life forms, different living systems, and asks intrinsically, how can those systems develop to be healthier? So some people might think this sounds a little bit like moral relativism, but I think this flexibility is something more like pragmatism. Instead of having absolute ethical rules and fixed ideas beforehand, this is a way of approaching ethics as engaged, as looking at, again, biological, psychological, social systems around us and asking what the conditions of flourishing in those systems are and trying to become the kind of people who are excellent at supporting those systems and flourishing. So we have a little poll for you. Have you ever seriously thought about changing your habits because of their ecological impact? I mean, seriously thought. Well, that's good. So we're all talking about something close to our hearts. And I waver on this question sometimes too. Sometimes I think about this more than other times. Maybe we can share some thoughts about that in a moment. So again, I want to broaden the horizons of thinking about human ethics. This has been part of the anthropocentric problem of maybe our culture in general, but philosophy in particular. We often think of values again as human-centered. A lot of the Greek virtues were based on courage in battle, or the kind of intellectual virtue that in that culture maybe only wealthy men could have. And so not everyone was given an opportunity to exercise virtue or develop it. And good habits were really not that inclusive. We can think of other cultures like Confucianism that's based on the family. Roman ethics and Stoicism has this idea of nobility. Maybe we can think of the ethics of our 20th century, 21st century business culture and some of the questionable values that are promoted there, very human-centric, very often egotistical, for example. And so part of our goal is to break that circle open and think really with that idea of how each thing flourishes in its own way. And this approach, I think, can help us develop a new set of values. So beyond those traditional values of courage, justice, and temperance, we might think of what would it be to have a virtue that's specifically ecological, right? Is frugality a virtue we should be thinking about more, or cooperation? What about grief? That's a tough one. How can we virtuously grieve in a world full of so much loss and difficulty? And what's the importance of magnanimity or generosity of spirit in a world of climate change. It's important to recognize that environments and the environment are the ultimate supports and enablers of our good habits. I want to think about the different environments. Think of our university environment in the Mitchell Center and the effort that goes into making and refining rich collective habits. And this idea that virtues are good habits because they're environmentally sensitive, right? So a habit that's virtuous is not just the repetition of the same behavior over and over again, as if learning to play the piano or guitar, I could only repeat the same song over and over. No, instead, habits are flexible. They're more like cultivated aptitudes or kind of new organs we can grow, right? When you learn to play guitar well, you can play a range of music and you can create your own music and adapt to others and improvise and so on. So I want to think of habits as, again, deeply personal, ecologically oriented and sustained. And I want to think about them as habits that not only involve an increasing sensitivity to the environments around us, but develop the possibilities of reshaping and enriching those environments too. An important part then of this virtue ethics is the question of how we learn habits, how we grapple with bad habits. And a big part of that story is exemplarity. Part of what this approach is really good for is recognizing the effectiveness of good moral examples. And in this case, I'm thinking of cases where we have clear examples of people who are showing us how developing new habits, new virtues like courage, like perseverance, like ecological concern and sensitivity are part of what's necessary to face the new problems we face, but also are joyous and empowering, right? So positive moral examples and exemplars are crucial to environmental virtue ethics. Again, environmental virtue ethics is both naturalistic and pluralistic. It's rooted in nature, but unlike a lot of other natural law theories or natural ethical theories, it's not so objectivist or strict, you could say. It's based in this idea that each individual and each living ecosystem or community is the index of its own flourishing. Again, virtue is the idea that we become good by practicing these ecological activities. Think of the virtue of listening. You cultivate it by doing it. Same as gardening, right? And there's no limit to how much sensitivity and insight you can develop there. And I think ultimately this approach is really then about motivation, right? Instead of just imposing rules or enforcing behaviors or looking at the person from the outside, it really asks us to learn how to develop healthy, sustainable habits. So when we face these big problems of why we should care about the environment, they're really these deep questions of how we've learned to be the kind of people we are. And I think that's where this approach can really help. Can help us develop virtues like equanimity in a difficult world, fair-mindedness. And it reminds us that a lot of this work is going to be up to new generations of people who are capable of developing more ecological character. One more question for you. I'm curious, in the pandemic, do you think you've had more time, less time, or maybe about the same amount of time to form better habits, perhaps better ecological habits, better habits in general? Interesting. So most people say more time and then about an even break for less time and about the same time, but a little more than half. I think that's really potent that this is an inflection point, both obviously for health and justice issues, but I think also for ecological ones. And I think this is a really important time to be having this discussion and also to be supporting the people who are feeling like they're in a difficult circumstance and experiencing difficulty thinking about changing their habits right now. Part of what this approach does is allow us to think about bad ecological habits and wrongdoing. So in the virtue ethics approach, I think there are basically three categories through which we can evaluate and judge negative ecological behaviors and habits, but not for the sake of being judgmental, for the sake of understanding, teaching, and promoting sustainable psychology, sustainable growth. So some actions are just outright wrong. Some actions don't permit a virtuous or balanced approach, right? So a virtue or habit is a responsive, balanced way of being attuned to and oriented to responding to an environment around you, whether it's human, natural, or other, etc. And some actions just don't admit of a balance, right? So we talk of a mean or a balance between two extremes when we talk about virtue or a good habit. You know, a good habit like courage is a balance between overconfidence and cowardice or something like that. So it's a very fine and difficult state to attain, right? Being courageous can be really difficult. We can overdo it with excess, and there are deficiencies. But some actions just aren't like that. Extreme wastefulness, harming, killing, maleficence, extinction. There's no moderate amount of those things. They can't be done in a balanced and sensitive way. They just go against nature. We can look at them as intrinsically wrong. What gets more difficult is thinking about these other two categories of moral delinquency or abandonment and also vice. Moral delinquency and abandonment is a difficult category to think about because it involves habits where we know what's right, but don't choose to do it or are not habituated to go that way. So knowing what's virtuous and choosing what's not. We know that a lot of our actions and decisions are not ecologically good, and yet we make them anyway. And that's true in a lot of other ways with respect to like our health, our finances, our deadlines for our assignments, and so on. Why do we do that with respect to climate change? How can we understand those habits? Are they problems of not being informed enough? Are they problems of a weakness of willpower or overpowering temptation and desire? Are they part of a culture that teaches us to think this way without us being aware of it? And again, reflecting on this idea that we are our habits, bad habits are difficult to grapple with because we are those habits. That's Dewey's reflection. And so there's one category of moral problem, I think, with environmentalism that's not quite a vice, not quite a really bad habit, but involves this knowing what's right and choosing what's wrong. I think that is really difficult. It can be a temporary state. It can lead to worse things. It might involve some guilt or awareness that a healthier way of living is possible, a more virtuous development of your habits, but it involves that sense of struggle, right? So people struggle with that. I struggle with that. There's the possibility of a re-educative renewal there. But ethically, and I think this is where virtue ethics helps us with these fine-grained distinctions, vices are another level of problem yet in character. Vices are a wicked problem because they involve bad habits that are unconscious of themselves as bad habits. They become self-perpetuating, self-reinforcing. They can limit growth in forming new habits. They can have negative, disastrous ecological consequences. And most of all, what makes them a wicked problem is that these are the kind of habits that we desire as if they're good. You know, we're willing to defend them. We're willing to argue about them. They're vices because they are so unphilosophical and they resist self-awareness so much. And that becomes, as a person trying to be virtuous, a very difficult and ethically sensitive domain to enter, dealing with someone else's or your own vices. So I want to think, what are some of those vices? Can we think of indifference, apathy, greed, wastefulness? Are those vices that fit this ecological category? Again, the goal here is not to judge or virtue signal. Judging, virtue signaling itself is a kind of moral excess of moral judgment. We want to have the right balance of that. It's much more about an approach of exemplarity and humility, right? It's not about being right. It's about being sensitive to the demands of another person or a culture's flourishing. And if you have another person with ecological vices or a culture with ecological vices, it can be very difficult to be humble and empathetic and friendly and try and help them flourish. Very quickly, I have this chart that I can share with you later, just demonstrating that each virtue is a balance between extremes. It's not a balance between extremes mathematically. Aristotle says this is more like carpentry than mathematics or geometry. It involves some practical know-how, some experience, things you can only learn by doing and refining the experience of the particular world. Again, your environments. We can think a lot of about a lot of these traditional virtues like courage, temperance, generosity, but I want to think humbly about humility and other ecological virtues. So I've suggested some here, like interdependence as a balance between overdependence and narcissism, the right amount of concern for climate change as a balance between false confidence and anxiety, a respect for nature between anthropocentrism and romanticism or sentimentality, a way to use technology that's not resigned to its negative effects, nor overly optimistic in utopian and greenwashing. What we're doing right now, a way of being interdisciplinary that is not trapped in disciplinary distinctions like technical philosophy, but also not losing those distinctions altogether and finding that right balance. That's something we can continually improve on. And I want to think about virtues of dependence and not just ability and empowerment, like vulnerability, and the role that might play in the 21st century struggle with climate change. Very quickly, some questions for your breakout rooms. Does climate change change the structure of virtues? For example, we always say patience is a virtue. Do we have time for patience anymore if there are 12 years left to make an impact? How can we experience wonder and joy, discovery in the face of despair and a lot of difficult news? What are your climate virtues? Who are your climate exemplars? How can you think of courage as a way of facing the unknown and changing environments and communities? How can we find friendliness for people who don't agree with us and truth making through holding other perspectives that we find difficult or impossible? How can we form more virtuous habits that integrate our personal sense of health with a sense of planetary health? In medical ethics, we talk about, for example, making a living will that involves donating organs and using treatments that are ecologically sustainable and integrating your sense of health with social and planetary health. Can we have virtues that involve interspecies solidarity? Can we develop virtues that are more multicultural and respect different ways of knowing and wisdom? How do we grapple with those ecologically negative habits like indifference or decadence or delinquency on the one hand, and really dangerous moral vices and really bad self-hiding, self-perpetuating habits on the other, the vices? How can we identify those bad habits and constructively approach them? Should we approach every person with the same moral demands? Is everyone in the same position to make these changes or be this kind of example? How can economics play a role, or is there a limitation to that role in incentivizing virtuous ecological behavior? Should we think of government policy as having a virtue ethics component? When the first New Deal came around, there was certainly a lot of ethos around rebuilding the nation and the value of work and a work ethic and national values, national pride. If there's a Green New Deal or new climate pact, should that also reflect what kind of people we have to become to address these problems? And what are the virtues in your field, in your community? What are the way you think about good habits and how might you share that with others? So that's a lot at the end. That's just to give you some a little bit of a philosophical buffet to feed on. I hope we can split into the breakout groups for about 8 minutes, at which point we'll reconvene, and I'll be happy to hear what you shared with each other and answer any questions you have. Hope you had productive chats. I'd love to hear a little from each group about any opportunities, insights, or issues or problems you saw. I'm happy to answer any general questions too. I did rush through 2,000 pages of Aristotle in 20 minutes, so 2,000 years really. So if anyone wants me to go over anything or explain why I think this is important again, I'm happy to do that too.
Thanks, Don, for your talk today. Something that was really interesting in your breakout room is that someone had brought up a change in diet. COVID, you asked if people had more time, less time, or maybe about the same to change habits. And one woman had shared that she has had more time and that able to watch some Netflix documentaries that changed her ethical views of her diet. And what was interesting there, that as a group, we were able to discuss how diet is an accessible topic for me to begin thinking about ethical implications of their individual behavior on the environment. And in that, another student had posed that we all eat. And so it becomes, and maybe in some spaces, it's a privileged conversation to have about the ethical implications of our diet, but it's still true that it seems like a more accessible conversation. So it was an interesting breakout group that we had.
And, I think COVID has us asking a lot of uncanny ethical questions, like, is laziness a virtue now? Like, is staying at home on my couch good for public health? And I don't think laziness is a virtue, but a certain traditional image of staying at home that's not been so honored in our culture might be good for climate change and for COVID. But that's just a thought. That the example of nutrition sounds really good. Any other groups want to share insights or questions?
I think something that was interesting. Thanks for the talk. Very, very, very good. I think something that was super interesting in what we discussed is more an issue or like an open question than like a solution. It's mostly the question like, seems that developing new habits will ask us to do it like together as a group. And we kind of wondered, oh, well, at least it's something I wonder a lot about. How can we develop new habits? How can we practice new habits together as a collectivity? Because habits tend to have this individual sense to it, but like I think it's pretty clear in what you showed that it doesn't have to be so. So I think it's especially in times of COVID where we had like to question a lot how we relate to social life and all of this, and do we need to sacrifice the social aspect for the economy or the contrary? I think it raises a lot of question to how can we together as a collectivity generate habits and work through with that. And also maybe as a kind of just the only thought I have on that, like this kind of formed is this notion I really like of virtue ethics, of the fact that actions aren't on a spectrum and they're not done for virtue signaling or just say it's all or nothing. It's either like you're graceful or you're a disgrace. And I think as a level of collectivity, it renders everything very interesting because it forces us to generate habits better. So yeah, very, very thought-provoking talk, actually.
Yeah, habits are.
Oh, Don, I was just going to say that Paloma has a question in the chat for you that she may want to say out to, but didn't mean to interrupt your reply.
Maybe the reply can feed into that just very quickly. The virtues are hard. They're hard because we have to do them as groups. They're hard because we have to often develop them when the dominant groups around us don't value those things. try telling someone you're majoring in philosophy and you'll get a lot of unwanted life advice. But but they're also hard, as you mentioned, Thomas, because they're a balance between extremes. So it's easy to do too much or too little, and it's always possible to be more subtle, more refined. The question in the chat, I think, I think about ethics as something we've always done together, even when we've learned to be very individualistic. And so we could think about that. But some people in communities are not in a position to do that. So if you're reliant on having a car, for example, this is, part of the question of what can we expect of each person? And I think the virtue ethics allows for some flexibility there. Someone in our group asked about developing nations and trade-offs, where wealthy nations extract a lot of value and so on. We know the story, but we could think about cap and trade and carbon credits, and a lot of arguments getting made, not just philosophically, but at an economic level, that it's beneficial to give more of those trade-offs to developing nations because they're at a different point in the arc of their flourishing than we are. So you do see these arguments get made in the economic sphere, but some of those things are just the problems. How do you be virtuous in a society that's opposed to those virtues? How do you do that in rural Maine when you have to drive a car around? Well, I'd like to hear about your story and how we can think about that, because what it will take to be virtuous there is different than what it's going to take somewhere else. And I do think feeling that right, learning to feel the right balance between hope and optimism and defeat and despair is also part of the story of virtue, like learning to feel realistic about these things and pragmatic about these things.
Don, how do you find students responding to your analysis in your classes?
So we go through different ideas. Today, we're really talking about one ethical framework. It's really nice when you have them laid out side by side, you get more of a prism and more of that pluralism. I think students and people like talking about this one because we can talk about habits like driving and nutrition, and the big things are there in the little things, right? So, we can have this discussion at the level of policy or technology, but just thinking about our personal lives, I think this is a place where a lot of things are at stake ecologically and ethically. We don't often think of how we eat as deeply reflective of the kind of person we are and the kind of ecological values we have, but there it is. And so, I think this is part of the richness of philosophy here, that we can go into our habits at any level and say, well, I don't really notice that. I don't pay attention to those habits. And it turns out they have some, not just ecological impact, but they involve a way of dealing with the world that I'm not always aware of. And so I think people like talking about that, and it opens the door to a kind of personal growth and just seeing that change is possible.
How did you decide what questions to ask us in the poll? And why did you ask those? How were they intended to help us understand?
Most basically, I want people to see that philosophy is about who they already are and what they're already doing and what they're already thinking about. Secondly, the first question, have you ever thought about changing your habits, perhaps particularly in light of climate change? I think that's a good question. It's also a loaded question because, as we saw in the presentation, thinking and doing and habituating are very different things. So like I think about changing my habits all the time. Do I do that? A lot of those things are, sitting dusty in my closet or whatever, my projects and things like that. And so I think seeing that this matters to us is important, but then seeing that we all take it seriously is important, but then asking that question of ourselves, why do I know what's right and not do it? Why is that like just this individual, but this big cultural problem? And maybe there are psychological and economic and other answers, but as a philosophical problem, you know, as a kind of rational, intelligent species we are, that one's a wicked problem. And then the last question, I'm just really curious about how you're all doing with COVID, and if people do see a possibility of growth, even though the world is so difficult, and even though our social and intellectual life is kind of reduced to, you know, our domestic space. So that one was just a little more like, is this important right now? If you're all too busy to think about changing your habits and too stressed out, it's not the right time. But you know, and we should recognize that people are there right now. But I think a lot of people are poised in that other place right now, where they're thinking like, maybe this is a wake up call to think about changing myself and being an example to others. So I think that's really the coolest part about virtue ethics, is that we can look around for exemplars. You know, we recognize them.
I think we're all sorry that our time has run out, and you can't see us clapping, but we're clapping. And if people wanted to follow up with you, Ruth has kindly provided your email address, because I think, you know, people will want to follow up. I have about 20 cards here of different questions that, from the way you were describing things, I think people were probably thinking about. So I hope that we'll all follow up with you. And everyone, although I can't find out from you about this, I hope that you go home tonight and talk to somebody about what you learned, what you understood, what you didn't understand, why this makes a difference. And then when we come back together again, we could talk about who we talked with. So Don, we're so happy to have you a part of our community and helping us learn. And David, I don't know if you have anything you want to add.
No, Don, this is just wonderful. I'm going to do exactly what Linda just suggested. I've got a colleague on the West Coast. I'm going to tell him all about your talk, and I'm going to follow up with him in a couple of days to talk to him more about it. So it's just absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks everyone. I appreciate being here. And for me, this is a learning experience. This is a new habit for me. So it will take a while to learn to do it well.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.